Hey guys, this is Tori Petersen with the I Love You Already podcast, where we talk about how to live and love well. Today, I get to interview Emily Freeman. She's the author of the book, How to Walk into a Room. And during this podcast, we talk about when to stay and when to walk away, which I think both are really hard decisions. If that's something that you are thinking about or wrestling through, you're going to want to give this a listen. Let's do it. Emily P. Freeman, I am so thankful to have you on the I Love You Already podcast.
Oh, Tori, it's so good to be here with you.
Yes, Emily, I want to start off by telling you one of the ways that your ministry has just blessed me, poured into me, made me think to do something different. You talk about limiting voices. And I think all of us, a lot of us, we follow a lot of people like on social media.
Yeah.
We read a lot of books because really like a lot of the content it can look good, that we're taking in. But I felt like I was in this time where it felt like I had to dream bigger. I had to acquire more. Everything that I was doing was not good enough. And it wasn't because I was actually really content with everything that I was given, with the work that I got to do. I felt really grateful until I heard someone else say that I needed to do more. And so you made some kind of post. Thankfully, you were one of those good ones. You made a post. And I think it was your Substack, actually. I'm on your email list, and you were writing about limiting the voices that we listen to. And for me, I'd always heard like seek wise counsel. The wise have many voices. And so I was like, I got to have a lot of voices in my life. If I want to stay wise, I need to keep listening to people above me, people who have gone before me. And that was kind of my mentality. But I read that and it just made me think. And so what I did was I went and I unfollowed like a ton of people and actually went to my bookshelf and I threw away about 20 books.
Wow.
And we have a lot of books in our house. So that was that sounds like a lot, but it actually wasn't that much. But it almost made me feel, just like in the months afterwards, it's made me feel lighter, and it's given me such a sense of clarity. Can you talk a little bit about limiting voices? You're going to explain it much better than I feel like I can. So can you explain what that means?
Absolutely, Tori, because I think we've all been where you were, which was in a place of kind of looking around and wanting to make sure that we were learning what we need to learn and listening to who we felt like had maybe done the things that we hadn't learned yet. For me personally, I remember this about 10 years ago or so, I found myself what I call it now is I was collecting gurus. And that means I was like signing up for all these different email lists. I was buying books that sounded good and kind of trying to read them, but only getting through like a couple of chapters before I moved on to the next one. And I found myself almost like distracted with advice.
Guilty.
And
yes.
When I really got honest about what was happening with me, what was happening at that time was I was actually avoiding facing a big decision that I actually needed to make. And instead of making that big decision, I avoided that. And instead I sought clarity in these smaller areas of life. And I'm talking like I signed up to learn from like a outfit guru, like how to put outfits together. And then like skincare products, like what are the best skincare products for my skin type? Oh, let me take this quiz to see what type of skin I have and things like that. You know how we can get in those moods where we're like taking little quizzes and to learn our type of everything from head to toe. And for me, that was a distraction tactic from actually facing the real thing that I needed to do in a place that and that decision, I probably did need some counsel. But it wasn't from all the smaller, like the random gurus I was following. And that's not to say that those things can't be valuable and helpful in smaller doses. But I think when we recognize, like in our inbox or on our bookshelves, that we have a lot of a guru collection of like a lot of advice from a lot of different voices, it can be a good time to just kind of take stock and take a pause and ask ourselves, is there something I'm avoiding? Is there a decision that I need to make that is tripping me up in a way that it's I'm not really seeking the advice I need. And I would say the opposite of guru collection would be, maybe not the opposite, but instead of collecting gurus, I found it better to create or to find co-listeners. And these are people who I trust, who know me, who know my core values, who know what matters most to me, and who can really provide some space for me to share, like, hey, I'm struggling with this decision. And here's the things that matter to me. And here's what I'm afraid of. And here's what I long for. Can you reflect back to me what you hear me saying? And these are usually people who actually know me in real life, and I can actually have a conversation with. So again, it's not bad to seek counsel, but I think it's important to pay attention to who I'm seeking that counsel from.
Yeah. Oh, so good. Yeah, that message has been such a gift to me. And I just like, we're going to go right there because I want other people to hear it, because I think that message, it's something that I don't think that's like a typical message that you're going to hear, but it is so crucial and so needed. So thank you. We usually start the podcast off, all the podcasts, with the same question. And that is, what is one act of love that you have received in your lifetime that has affected who you are?
Well, there are many, as I'm sure many people have trouble picking.
Yeah.
But I think one act of love that I've received in my lifetime, and I'll say, as an adult, because that's sort of what comes to mind first, is being listened to. And many people have listened to me well, but I think, I can't remember off the top of my head who it is that says, being listened to feels a lot like love. And I think that's true. And so I know my husband, John, has done this for me for many years, is that rather than trying to fix or one up or advise, he holds a lot of space and listens to me. And I think that has given me the freedom to make my own mistakes, to become who I really am, because it's not someone else trying to enforce their agenda on my issues. But it helps. I can hear myself better and I can hear God better when someone provides space for me to be listened to. So I think that's probably one of the most profound acts of love we can offer for one another.
Yeah, being a good listener. So yesterday, we've been recording these podcasts in batches. And yesterday, the theme of what people were saying was the love that they received was like people not playing like the hero in their life. And today, the theme is listening. I just think it's
Wow.
so,
Isn't that something?
yeah, it's like every single one of you that we've recorded today said that they were loved by being listened to. And so obviously there is an emphasis of, be slow to speak and quick to listen. God wants us to hear that through these podcasts, evidently. And so I'm writing my second book right now, and I just handed it in and got back my edits and went through the first editing round process. And I wrote a chapter about leaving being not an act of, I always thought that staying was an act of love. And so I wrote the chapter with the idea that leaving, it can also be an act of love. And I just wrote one chapter on it, and I felt like it was a really hard chapter to write theologically, especially from a theological perspective. And you actually wrote a whole book on it.
A
whole
Tori.
book. And I was like, wow, that is so incredibly brave.
She did it. What was she thinking?
Yeah. And it's an amazing book, How to Walk into a Room. Can you tell us, what is the premise of this book? Why'd you write it?
Well, I've been talking about decision-making and discernment for many years now. I have a podcast called The Next Right Thing, and on it, we kind of move beyond the pro-con list to talk about things that happen beneath the surface that kind of inform our decisions that we make. But what I have found over the last 6.5 years of hosting this podcast and talking to listeners and readers is that some of the decisions that give us the most trouble are, there's the daily stuff and the decision fatigue that we have from just making regular life decisions. But the ones that are the hardest are when we're discerning to stay or leave in a space that we have loved, in a space or in a community that has built us or that we helped to build. And oftentimes, I think because of what you just said, the narratives that we have about staying and the narratives we have about leaving, those narratives can be really strong. And what I mean by that is, depending on your own social location, your family of origin, we all have stories we tell ourselves about what it means about us if we are stayers or if we are leavers. Some would say if you're a quitter. We all have, and I mean, right now, probably we all have stories in our lives that we could tell about times when we felt negatively about ourselves because we either stayed too long and weren't brave to make a move, or when we quit too soon and we felt like maybe we were cowardly because we didn't stick it out. We all have these stories. And what I found is sometimes those narratives get in the way of us truly discerning with God and the people who love us what our next right thing is, instead of actually making a move where maybe God might be leading, or staying in a place where God and maybe we might want to stay. Instead, we allow those narratives and those stories to make the decision for us and kind of cuts us off before we get to move through that discernment process, because we have so many attachments to these spaces that have defined us and that we have found home in, and rightly so. And so I wanted to have at least help to begin a conversation for people to begin to ask better questions, even if nothing changes, but to ask questions about these spaces that we're in so that we can make decisions informed not just by our old stories that we tell ourselves, but informed by courage and by who we are becoming and by how God might be living and moving within us in a new way than maybe we've experienced in the past.
Mm-hmm. You said that we tell ourselves stories, and I spent a good amount of time in the foster care system growing up. And so to me, I always associated leaving when people kicked me out, when I had to go to the next home, as abandonment. And so into my adulthood, and I also, because I grew up the way that I did, I was used to dysfunctional, unhealthy relationships. So then I entered into dysfunctional, healthy relationships when I was in college and in my younger adulthood. And anytime I would think, oh, wow, this relationship is really dysfunctional, I think I need to leave, I would think, well, leaving is abandonment, and I can't abandon people the way that I have been abandoned. And so I would remain in these like cyclical, unhealthy, toxic relationships. And I had to learn how to discern when to leave. And I had to learn that leaving can be done in wisdom and in love as well. And so can you talk about some signs or flags that help us discern when to stay and when to walk away?
I love the question, and your story is a perfect example of how strong those narratives are and how they always inform our decisions. They always do, whether we know it or not. And so when we're in a space, a relationship, a room, a commitment, and we begin to sense some discomfort, I think it depends on our personality. Some of us will run out at the first sign of trouble, and I don't know that that's the best move. Others of us will stay no matter what, and I don't know that that's the best move either. And so your question is a good one, which is, how can we begin to discern? What flags are we paying attention to? And so I think it's important to recognize that not every hesitation is a red flag. I'll give you an example. When I was first starting out in this work of being an author and traveling to speak and different things like that, I remember getting an invitation early on where it was just like things were a little ambiguous. The request kept getting bigger of the speaking request. And I remember thinking like, I don't know, it's probably good, but I don't know if I'm going to do it. And I asked my friend Holly, I was like, I've got this request and I'm not sure about it. And she said, well, it sounds like you're sensing some red flags. And I was like, yeah, but they're small. I was like, I have like a few small red flags. And Holly said, Emily, tiny red flags rarely shrink. They only grow. And I
Mm.
have found that to be very true, Holly. Thank you for
Mm.
that. And it's true in relationships. It's true in vocational decisions. It's true across the board. But here's what I would say one step before that is that not every hesitation is a red flag. And so I think the first question is to discern, is this hesitation a red flag? Or is it just a yellow flag that's inviting me to slow down and to pay attention and to ask myself some questions? And so I tend to now just assume every hesitation is a yellow flag. And time will tell, and God will help me to know if it is a red flag. And then once I name it as a red flag, then I can know it's probably not going to shrink. But I think some questions we can ask ourselves are things like, for example, is this a space that I chose or did this space choose me? And when I chose it, if I did, what were the circumstances at play? And have those circumstances changed? Another question you can ask yourself is, who's in this room with me now? Who has already left this room? And who's walking in? Who's committing to this space where I am and who has already left it? That can be informative. Again, none of these questions by themselves, I don't think are enough to help us make our decision once and for all, but they can help to be arrows rather than an answer. They're like arrows to help us know, like, okay, that's interesting. That's information. I'm going to take that in and consider it. And that's all part of the discernment process.
Mhm. So in a situation like that where, maybe we're bumping up with our work or an opportunity, and it's like sometimes our work and the opportunities that we're given, it's like, well, not everything in our work is enjoyable. Sometimes things like will be hard and we kind of have to press through it. I'm asking this because in my relationships, that was another kind of narrative that I had was like, well, like relationships are hard work. So you have to stick in them and you have to keep doing the hard work. And so how do we tell the difference between doing the hard work and also intentionally pursuing peace?
Yeah. I think there's a difference between the peace that comes from avoiding something hard and the peace that comes from doing the deeply right thing. And sometimes it can be hard to tell the difference. I think one way to begin to discern that is in this space, relationship, or activity, commitment, am I able to be myself? And in other words, the things that make me me, the things that I value the most, are they honored here? Or do I find myself constantly having to edit what I really think, to hold back who I really am, or to somehow mask what I really think so that I can continue to fit in here? If people who knew me the best showed up in this space and were a fly on the wall and observed me here, would they recognize me? Or would they have a lot of questions for me at dinner that night? Because they're like, Emily, what are you doing here? That wasn't even you. And I think those can be some questions to begin to discern, like, is this just I'm in a space that's hard because it's hard to be a grown up and I just need to push through? Or is this hard because it's dysfunctional, it's unhealthy, and maybe even unsafe for me to be here? And I think those questions can help us begin to tease out the difference.
This is kind of in your book when you address people pleasing.
Yeah.
People stay in relationships and they do it by kind of saying what they know the other people want them to say, or they do what people would like them to do, and then they stay longer than they should. And so what happens when we're in a situation and we have the peace, right? Like we're like, okay, I think I can walk out of this, but I especially think about this for like a job. So you have the peace. You're like, all the signals are kind of pointing for me that I can go, but I won't have financial support. I can't financially support my family. The means at which this provides for me, I will no longer have. And then there's the flip side of like, you maybe are good with the means. You don't need what's being provided to you, but you don't have the peace.
I think what you're talking about is that sometimes you're ready to go, but it's not time. And other times it's time to go, but you don't feel ready. And oftentimes we're looking for what we what we look for and what we hope for is when readiness and timeliness align really, really well. And like, it's time to go. I'm ready to go. Yay. We make the toast. We have the party and it's time. But just so rarely in life do we get those sweet, sweet closures
Yeah.
of endings. So many times it's, I'm ready to go. I've made my peace with leaving, but we don't have an income. And so I have to wait. And now that doesn't mean that it will never be time to go. But what it can mean is you're going to cultivate a practice. You're going to learn a practice of patience that you maybe would not have chosen and don't want, but here you are. Because there is a such thing as it might not be time, but that doesn't mean that it won't be time soon or at a date that's sooner than it would have been had you not taken the time to name that you were ready to go. And on the flip side, sometimes it's time to go and you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm not ready at all. Like, what do you mean this job is over? Like, I wasn't ready for this. I didn't expect this. And you're kind of left to pick up the pieces of something when someone else said, no, it's time. And you're like, well, I wasn't ready. And that's when we can cultivate a practice of courage, of recognizing like, well, I wasn't ready, but this is beyond my scope. And here I am. Now what? And now you're in a hallway where you might be between things. And the hallway can have really beautiful and unique things to teach us, things we may rather not learn. But I do think that it can be a really transformative space when we're not ready, but someone else says it's time.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a story that you would feel comfortable sharing where you left, you walked away, and there was fruit that came of it, that you knew it was the good choice?
Yeah. You know, I have a lot of stories like that. I think one that comes to mind is, so I started and co-ran a business for writers, an online company for writers that helped writers develop and learn the art of writing and also the business of publishing. And so we did that from 2015. And the business is still going on now, but around 2022, after about 7 years of it, was when, I had discerned it was time for me to exit that space. And, that was hard because it was a business I helped to grow. It was a community of writers who I loved and had invested a lot in. And it was a company I co-ran with a couple of other business partners. And this was an example, Tori, of like a time when I was actually ready to go long before it was time for me to go. We had kind of discerned, my time to leave might have been 2020, 2021, but then the pandemic hit and all plans went out the window. And so it became like a period of waiting, and I had to cultivate some patience. And so the timing was tricky and it was hard, and I would have done some things differently. But at the end of it, it was September of 2022 when I ended up exiting, and it was bittersweet. It was it was the right time. It was the right decision. It was hard because I had to let go of something that I had put a lot of time and energy and effort into. But looking back now, what it afforded me and the gifts it gave me was, it gave me a lot of margin to do some different type of work that I had been having to put off for a really long time. It gave me more, a lot of creativity was birthed out of it because, just the specific work that I was doing, I was working with writers and helping them with their work. But what that meant for me was I wasn't actually doing a lot of writing myself, which often happens when you start to teach. And so that was a gift that I sort of got back. But at the time, I really only knew what I was leaving. I didn't fully know what I was stepping into. And I think sometimes that can keep us in rooms longer than we might need to be in, is because we're afraid of what might come next.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people, they fear leaving, or they kind of stick around longer because we crave closure. I've been looking into this idea of closure because when I was in the foster care system, oftentimes when you move homes to homes, you just leave. Like, you don't really say bye. Sometimes you don't even pack your belongings. Like, the caseworker comes in, packs your belongings for you, and they just bring it to the next home. And then there were some situations where I feel like I wanted an apology. I wanted an apology for the ways that I was hurt. Like, that would have brought what I would refer to as closure. And so I looked up the definition of closure as I was trying to think about, why is this so important to us? Why do we want it? And one of the definitions was that it is a feeling of resolution from like emotional trauma. And it's like, oh, no wonder we want to feel that. Well, no wonder we're like, that's something we're trying to grasp for. So what would you say to the person who's like, I really am seeking closure, but they're actually not going to get it?
Hmm. Endings always come, but closure's a luxury. And I think that so often, actually, I'd say more often than not, we don't get closure. And because we expect closure to look a particular way. We expect it to look like tied up ends, and I got my apologies, and I got to explain myself, and people explained themselves to me, and we all agreed, and we shook hands, and it was over. Instead, what I think we get are messy middles. We get half-truths. We have to leave stories behind that we never got to tell. We have to let go of people's opinion of us, of the conversations that are had in rooms that we weren't allowed to go into. And then we just like have to move on, and it's not great. So what I have found for me is to name the ending I got, to grieve the ending that I wanted, and to find a way to mark that ending imperfectly, to mark it by naming what are the gifts of the room that I was in that I'm going to bring with me? And what are the burdens or the things that weren't great about that room that I'm choosing to leave behind? That gives me back some agency in the process, especially in a room if I was kicked out of the room or if it was someone else's choosing for me to leave, like you talked about when you were little and they would pack your things up and you didn't really have a choice in it. Giving ourselves back some agency of making some choices about, well, here's what I'm going to leave in that room, and here's what I'm going to bring with me into the next one. Those are some ways that I have found for me personally that have helped to create closure and to bless the endings I got, even though they were far from the endings that I wanted.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about grieving? Because I think people understand the concept of grieving when it comes to someone passing away or possibly a person stepping out of their lives. But people don't often, sometimes we don't think about grieving in other spaces and how we need to allow ourselves to do that.
Oh, grief. What a word and what an experience. There's a writer, Amanda Held-Opelt, who I think writes really beautifully about grief. She wrote a book called A Hole in the World. And in it, she shares about the grief rituals found around the world that people engage in. And she writes from a place of having lost her older sister, who died. And like you said, I think we can learn a lot from people who have experienced that type of profound grief.
Yeah.
But I think it's also a transferable skill, really, to grieve in other ways too. And I would say we probably don't know how to grieve. I think we don't give ourselves permission to grieve some of the small things. Like, for example, some of these smaller goodbyes, some of these rooms that we've left that we might discount and say, well, nobody died. Or, well, I mean, nothing, it wasn't that bad. We constantly are making excuses for ourselves and sort of trying to explain to our emotions why they shouldn't feel particular ways. But the reality is our bodies are going to continue to carry that around. And so the quicker we are to acknowledge these, what might be considered small griefs or tiny griefs, I think the more we'll be unburdening ourselves to be able to walk into our next room a little bit more free and a little bit more able to flourish because we have allowed ourselves to say goodbye to small things like, even joyful things like, if you have children, your children moving on to the next grade. I remember I had a profound grief when my children went from elementary school to middle school. And it sounds almost silly, like, yay, they moved on to middle school, but nobody told me to be ready for the sadness I would feel when we didn't have kids in elementary school anymore, because it was like, it was this period of life that, I can roll my eyes like, Emily, get over it. Your kids are growing up. It's a whole thing. But like, there's some things I had to let go of. There's some, processes and ways of being a parent that changed that I'll never go back to. And there are new gifts to be found there. But I think just giving myself a little bit of room to grieve what was, and then to begin to embrace what is, I think it's really important for for our becoming process as humans, especially when it comes to kind of entering the new spaces that we're walking into.
Mm-hmm. Emily, something that I really appreciate about you is the language that you use.
Mm-hmm.
It's so inviting and compassionate. I think you don't speak in absolutes. I think sometimes that can be really, especially in a space where you're talking about people healing, people walking away, people grieving. Like when you speak in like these absolutes, like we must, we should, it can be kind of hurtful and hard for other people. And when we speak that over ourselves too, like we can be being hard on ourselves. And you speak with such compassion for yourself and for the listeners. And so how can we have compassion for ourselves as we are walking through this, when to walk away, when to stay, and just making everyday life decisions? Because the compassion that you have is so evident.
Mm.
And Jesus looked upon the people with compassion. Like we should compassion. Have. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. You know, Tori, I have found it to be true that honoring and elevating human dignity above human certainty has been something that I find to be the most transformative practice. And I think that in every way, not just your dignity as a human person made in the image of God, as someone in whom Christ dwells and delights, but also in myself, my own human dignity above my certainty. When I stake my claim in like, I am certain of this, we must blah, blah, like, I don't like how it feels in my body.
Yeah.
I don't like how it feels in the way that I even hold my shoulders when I say stuff like that, because I have found that to be hurtful in my own life and in the lives of others. Instead, I think it's helpful to imagine the table in the kitchen of the kingdom of God just keeps growing. And God keeps inviting us to sit and to stay longer and to pass the bread among one another. And that's the image that I hold on to, that I think allows me to offer compassion to others. And probably more importantly, in some ways, and more difficult, is to receive the compassion given to me from others and from God. And that's a practice. I mean, that's something that I've had to practice over time, because I came, years and years ago, college age specifically. I remember I was much more of a black and white girl. And I think maybe developmentally, that's just how we start out black and white. And then as we grow, we learn, there's many shades of gray here. And that can be really beautiful. But I think that's sometimes where the compassion seeps in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you are giving people permission to change, especially to change their minds. Mm-hmm. I don't think that we're given the permission to do that enough. I think being in a space of people who come from backgrounds of trauma and hurt and dysfunctional families, a lot of people struggle with mental illness. And I think in the church, we can hear, like, take that thought captive. Just kind of like, I don't know what they're called, but those little, quotes that kind of fall short, or even like these scriptures taken out of context that fall short and we don't know why. And I see a lot of people, especially with mental illness, who are just struggling to grasp on to hope because of these absolutes and this cheap advice that is given to them. Can you say something to them that would just be encouraging?
Man, I agree with you, Tori, that I think that's when we find ourselves in spaces and with loved ones and in ourselves of struggling with or living with some type of mental illness. There's a lot of shame attached to that I don't think should be.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend mention once that, if we had a broken leg, we would not hesitate to say, like, oh, I have a broken leg. I've got a cast and I'm getting some help with it. Like, it just is. Mm-hmm. And I would love to see a world where the same goes for when we're struggling in our mental health, that we say, well, I'm feeling depressed, or I'm feeling anxious, or I have this issue that I'm living with and I'm getting help for it. And I have a counselor, and I maybe take some medication, and I'm also learning to pray in a different way, and I'm finding support, and that is all a natural way of that we are able to enter into and walk in community with one another. And I think too, I would say to someone who's in that space, I hope you have a person in your life who has made it their job to love you by their presence and not by trying to fix or advise you, but just is crawling down into that space with you and being with you. Because when I think about how God does that with us, it doesn't say that he keeps us from the valley of the shadow of death. It says, as we walk through it, God is with us in the valley of the shadow of death.
Yeah.
And
Amen.
sometimes I think I imagine that's what that feels like when you're in the midst of a darkness, of a deep, deep darkness, is a valley of a shadow of death. But knowing that you're not alone there, perhaps could give the smallest degree of hope.
Yeah, I know that that is not like your expertise. That's not like the place where you are like writing books about, but I was like, I think that these listeners are going to be really blessed by her answer. So thank you for just letting me go there. And thank you so, so much, Emily, for doing this podcast with me and for all the wisdom that you put into the world, for all the places and spaces that you've created to hold uncertainty. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, Tori.